We're muted.
Yeah.
Okay. We're muted.
Sorry. Okay. Rabbi Sonny Schnitzer, spiritual leader of the Bethesda Jewish congregation, has been named by the Jewish Forward magazine as one of America's most inspiring rabbis. Rabbi Sonny has served as the spiritual leader of the Bethesda Jewish congregation since 2001 and will retire in June 2022. He holds a degree in Judaic Studies from Baltimore Hebrew University and was ordained in 1997 as Hazan by the Academy for Jewish Religion in New York City, and in 2011 as Rabbi by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlalme and the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. Rabbi Schnitzer is a member of the Rabbis for Human Rights, TRUA, the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society, and Faith United to Prevent Gun Violence, just to name a few of the advocacy organizations for which he associates. And he will begin our discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane, and good morning to all. Okay, so here's where I'm going to start. I'm not going to get verklempt here because you're already talking about my departure. But so the Torah always amazes me, our Bible, because as we go through the weekly cycle of Torah readings, it is almost inevitable we pull something out that's related to the issues of the moment. It's almost as if there's a divine hand in the timing of how our cycle of Torah readings come about and what's going on in our world. It's no different this week. We are in the cycle where Jacob is living with his now father-in-law, Lavan. He has now taken Rachel and Leah to wife, and he is fleeing from Lavan. And the Torah describes how Yaakov worked with all his might for Lavan. It says, "I worked with all my might for your father." And the great Jewish sage Maimonides cites these words that this is a requirement that workers work a full day and labor all your might. And as we read what's coming out of Glasgow this week and the conference on climate change, one of the things that becomes apparent is the difficulty that developing countries are having in even letting go of generation of what we call dirty power, and that's a very broad term, because of their situation of economic development and the situation in their countries regarding worker conditions, wages, etc. The protection of workers' rights is derived from this week's Torah portion. Now, Yaakov refers to his 20 years as a watchman over Lavan's flocks, and he comments, "By day I was consumed by scorching heat, and by night the frost when sleep was snatched from my eyes." So Jacob's words ultimately find their way into Jewish law, which prohibits an employer from harming his laborer's health. It puts strict guidelines on the degrees to which workers can be asked to stay up late at night to work. And there are hundreds of laws in rabbinic literature dealing with labor management relations. So the issue of workers' rights arises for me as it attaches itself to climate issues, because our current economic situation here and abroad really is driving our power consumption, and it's also driving how we create power. We've got an issue right now as we climb out of this pandemic to ask the question, what kind of jobs will workers do in the near future? Will the wages be fair? Will they work in safe conditions? Will they be exploited? The Jewish people in the 20th century were in the vanguard of the struggles to unionize industry and guarantee workers' rights and workers' safety. When we have to ask ourselves, are we going to take up this same fight in the new century? Or will we become even further removed from the laborers who produce what we consume? Let's face it, we all enjoy our designer athletic shoes made by a 12-year-old in Malaysia or India or Uruguay. in a dusty sweatshop who works for $1 a day, or closer to home, the Amazon fulfillment warehouse worker who works out of his car, who lives out of his car because he can't find decent, affordable housing at the wages he is paid. We want inexpensive and fashionable clothing, so too many people are willing to overlook the possibility that the cotton was produced using Uyghur slave labor. Now, all of us gathered here today are probably very good people. We think of ourselves as moral and honest, and we would never knowingly exploit others, but that's what we do. When we don't pay attention to the origins of the products we consume, we don't look at the labels, and we don't consider the welfare of the workers we hire through a third party. Sometimes our consuming practices just aren't kosher. And that's where we would dovetail into climate change. Because when we use the word kosher to describe anything that we consume, kosher literally means fit, as in fit for consumption, kasher. Now, the majority of American Jews, and I dare say the majority, in fact, I know the majority of members of BJC don't pay a lot of attention to kashrut, but maybe it's time we should. And I'm not talking about whether you eat crab cakes or cheeseburgers or pork. I'm talking about eco kashrut. I've spoken about eco kashrut often. Um, and I thought it was wise today to revisit this concept of what's fit for consumption by human beings. For example, is Bitcoin kosher? When you consider the carbon footprint, the incredible amount of electric power it takes to mine Bitcoin, and the reliance in many countries on coal to generate that electricity, that's a good question. And I'm going to hasten to point out, by the way, that according to one study, over 63% of Bitcoin owners worldwide are under age 40. So it's a strange factoid when one considers that this is the generation making the most noise, and rightfully so, about the looming climate disaster before us. But eco kashrut is an evolving concept, coined, I believe, originally by my teacher, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, and a shout out to Diane, you said it right. Um, and it's a range of Jewish teachings about caring for the earth, Bal Tashchit, about respecting animals, Tsar B'lei Hayim, protecting one's own body, Shmirat HaGuf, and not oppressing workers or exploiting customers, which is called Oshek. These teachings are incorporated into a set of simple daily practices to respect the earth, ourselves, and all other life. So, Eker kosher is a way of fusing many of Judaism's and spiritual people's central concerns and roots into a symbiosis. It's actually a very exciting movement within Judaism that's attracting a great deal of interest among both practicing and alienated Jews, especially the young, because there are opportunities to deepen our spiritual and environmental commitment, and the latter seeing a more progressive and contemporary Judaism. So we have to ask, and I think we always should ask, are the products we use and the foods we consume fit by the standards of this moment in time? So are you checking the labels of the clothes you buy at Target and other retailers to ensure, for example, they're certified by the Better Cotton Initiative, an organization that demands sustainable agricultural practices from its producers and also forbids the use of slave labor in its certification? Are you buying fair trade coffee? Are you buying fair trade chocolate? Are you trying to convert to solar? What are the products that you are using that honor the work and humanity of labor and also honor the planet, the creation? Now, if you do any of those things, you are beginning to practice eco kashrut, but it's an ongoing journey. And it's something that has to be at the height of our awareness. The truth of the matter is that because of the demands in developing countries, developing regions for wages for workers, this is always going to be a balancing act, just as it is in Glasgow right now, where third world countries in particular are reluctant to give up their reliance on coal because it's cheap. And so all of us, when we as the end consumer make these purchases, we should really have in the front of our minds this idea of eco kashrut. Thank you. That's my shtick.
Diane, are you
Diane?
muted?
You are muted.
Our second speaker today is Bob Deans, a BHPC member, author of Reckless Political Assault on the American Environment. Bob is the Director of Strategic Engagement for the NRDC Action Fund, a 501c4 affiliate of the nation's leading environmental advocacy organization, Natural Resources Defense Council. He has also spent nearly 3 decades as a journalist, including a stint as a chief Asia correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and other Fox newspapers. And Bob will be discussing latest updates from the COP26 Glasgow Conference and legislation needing urgent action on Capitol Hill. Bob?
So, am I muted? Am I?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great. I don't know if you all can see me. Can you?
No, you don't have your camera on.
Oh God. All right. Well, maybe that's a grace on this Sunday morning for you all. But anyway, I won't take time with that right at the moment, unless someone can tell me a quick way to do it. But I just want to double click on what Rabbi Schnitzer just said. It was so beautifully put. And I do think that we all are called upon to become consumers of conscience, if you will. And that was a very good reminder of why that's so important, because climate change, of course, is the existential environmental issue of our time. It's an economic issue. It's a humanitarian issue, and it's a justice issue fundamentally. Because as the rabbi said, the developing world that has done so little to bring this problem about has hundreds of millions of people living on the front lines of climate hazard and harm. And here in this country, we also have low-income communities, people of color, who are suffering disproportionate harm from rising seas, widening deserts, withering croplands, raging wildfires, storms, drought. And so it is a justice issue for us to try to address. I think there's a lot of good news to be talked about here today. Of course, Glasgow, which just wound up a few hours ago, and so I have to commend the people who scheduled this, because we're right between Glasgow and this very important vote in the House this week on the President's Build Back Better agenda, and both of these have at least the potential to move us forward in so many ways. So just briefly, Glasgow, we went into Glasgow, we needed 3 things. We needed ambition we need the world to raise ambition around what we're going to do to cut our carbon footprint, particularly in leading emitting nations like the United States, China, India, Russia, some others. The second thing we needed was more access to capital and technology for those developing countries to not only help them protect their people from climate hazard and harm, but also to make this transition to clean energy. And the third thing we needed was accountability. So ambition, access, accountability. We need to turn the promises made at Glasgow into the progress we need on the ground. And that means follow-up. That means increasing our ambition. That means developing better ways to monitor the metrics that we need to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. And so we got progress in all 3 of those areas, but let's be clear, we did not get what we needed. And we knew that going in, unfortunately. We knew that we were going to be constrained by a couple of things. 1, the global pandemic, and 2, the political landscape here in this country. These are limiting factors in terms of what we are able to achieve, but we went in there with a program. The president went to Glasgow. He spent 2 days there. He took 13 cabinet members, and he defined for the people of the United States and for the world this as the existential challenge of our lifetime. He talked about what we're going to do here in this country. And let's be clear, the Build Back Better agenda that's before the House this week would be the largest investment in US history in climate action. So that's important. We'll talk about it next. But important thing too, he showed up. He reversed 4 years of backsliding. Now, the United States still faces a long road ahead in restoring trust. We are, in fact, responsible for a fourth of the problem globally. We have put a quarter of the emissions in the air historically from this country. We are now at about 11% roughly, and we're very quickly going to move toward about 9%. China, of course, is the 28% of the problem currently. And you have to put that in context too, because we can talk about China more if somebody wants to. Finally, Build Back Better, moving forward this week. This is a plan that is right now currently, or you all have read those stories in the paper. We're looking at a 1.75 trillion package, probably down from 3.5 trillion what was asked for. We live in a situation where a senator from a coal state is now crafting our climate agenda. That's a little bit upside down, but that's the arithmetic in the Senate. There's no use beating our heads against that wall. That's where we are. Let's try to get people who can think a little bit more about the future and a little bit less about the past is the answer there. But we are going to get, if the Build Back Better piece passes, and it's a little confusing, so I think everybody knows this, but we passed an infrastructure bill on a bipartisan basis in the House and the Senate. The president's going to sign that tomorrow, roughly $1.2 trillion over 10 years now in investment in helping to revitalize our roads and bridges. There's also going to be something in there to help on climate, because it's going to help us to build several 100,000 charging stations around the country, which will help to speed the transition to electric vehicles. And it's going to help us with some climate resilience, particularly with respect to our power grid. But the real climate bill is the Build Back Better Act that is before the House this week. Probably toward the end of the week, the House is going to vote on this. It is imperative that this passes, because this really is the investment that we need. It's the centerpiece of the president's climate action plan. It will not, in and of itself, cut carbon pollution in half by 2030, which is the president's goal, but it will set us on the path to do that in concert with new and ambitious carbon pollution and health standards, primarily from the EPA, and also you hear the president sometimes talk about a whole of government approach to climate change. What he's talking about is making our public lands and federal ocean waters part of the climate fix instead of part of the problem. Talking about using every agency in the government to bring some focus to this climate issue. And so when you combine that with state and local and national standards, we can get where we need to go. We can cut our carbon footprint in half by 2030, which is what the science tells us we have got to do to avert the worst impacts of climate change. I'll close now and look forward to any questions, but I think it's important, my layman's reading of history is that progress only occurs when you have three things. You got to have hope, you got to have urgency, and you got to have resolve. In other words, we believe we can do this. We know we have to do it now. And by golly, we're not going to quit until we do. I take great hope in this. I went to Copenhagen in 2009. At that time, for these UN climate talks, at that time, the world was on track for 6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century. That would have been truly catastrophic. Much of the world would have become uninhabitable. We would not be living in the world that we live in today. By the time we went to Paris 6 years ago, we were on track for about 4 degrees of global warming. So I'm talking Celsius. that too is catastrophic. We know that the science tells us we need to hold warming down to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1.1 degree compared to pre-industrial times. And now we're on track for about 2.7 degrees Celsius. Again, catastrophic, but you can see we're making real progress. So this idea of bringing global leaders together at Glasgow, at Paris, and Copenhagen, this is making progress. This is focusing the world, and we emerge with the stronger consensus than ever before that fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, are the fuels of the past, and the future is going to be cleaner, smarter ways to power our economy. And that's very important.
Thank you, Bob. Our third and final speaker is Joelle Novi, Director of the Interfaith Power and Light, DMV. And she comes from Tikkun Leil Shabbat, an independent Jewish community in Washington, D.C. Joelle grew up in Baltimore and attended Chizek Ibuno congregation, and she is the author of Green and Just Celebrations, a purchasing guide that Jews United for Justice distributes to local congregations for assisting families with making greener purchasing decisions about weddings and bar and bat mitzvahs. Joelle worked at Green America, where she screened applicants for Green Business Network and wrote dozens of articles about green living for the organization's newsletter and magazine. And she's a graduate of Harvard University with a BA in social science and minor in religious studies. Welcome, Joelle. And you'll be talking about some of Interfaith Power and Light's initiatives.
Oh, thank you so much. I love Bradley Hills, and it's wonderful to be here. Yeah, so our question this morning is, what can an individual do? What can each of us do to take action on the climate crisis? And you've already heard two really good and correct answers to that question. You know, Rabbi Sunny's suggesting that we think about our purchasing power as individual consumers. And Bob is talking about our capacity to advocate for strong federal climate policy, also critically important in this moment. I wanted to offer that all of the ways an individual can respond sort of have one thing in common, which is that to be successful, they can't be done by yourself. So Bill McKibben, a writer and activist, says he's often asked, what can one individual do to take action on the climate crisis? And that's a question I get a lot too. And he says, don't be one individual. That's the answer, right? That anything that's any real response that we might have to the climate crisis is one that requires us to join with others and to be part of something larger than ourselves. So I am, and underlying all of these is a needed change in consciousness. So before I talk about some of the categories of action we can take, like Rabbi Sunny, I'm grounded in the Jewish cycle of readings, the Parsha that from the Torah that we read each week. And I'm also thinking about Jacob this week. And in this week's reading in the Jewish lectionary, Jacob goes to sleep on a rock with his head on a rock and dreams of this ladder with the angels going up and down upon it. And he awakes and understands he's connected to the sky in a way he hadn't understood before. And he says, wow, how awesome is this place? God was in this place and I didn't even know it. And the lot of Jewish chants and songs are made of this exclamation, Ma norah hamakom hazeh, how awesome is this place? And I think those of us alive in this moment have an opportunity to say that as well. First of all, how awesome is this land that we live on? And the land acknowledgement we opened with today invites us to understand that land differently, as not just as belonging to us and our current congregations, but as land first cared for by indigenous peoples, right? And how awesome is this place that's part of specific watersheds and specific ecosystems? And how awesome are these systems that have endured in a life-giving climate that's now threatened? But how awesome also, is this moment? So Jews talk a lot about moments in time and not just in place. So how awesome is this moment in time where we are the first generation to be experiencing the consequences of a damaged climate and the last generation that's going to be able to do anything about it. So that's not awesome, like really cool. That's awesome, like very sobering and intense. But it is an extraordinary moment we are in, and we need to say Mano Ra Hamakom Hazeh. How awesome, awe-inspiring is it to be alive in this moment, in this generation, when we have this critical role to play. And then, you know, how awesome is this community, this Zoom sanctuary in which Bradley Hills and, you know, is gathered this morning. Mano Raha Makom Hazeh. This how awesome is this community and the larger multi-faith community in which we are responding to this crisis together. I tend to see responding to climate change as having sort of three paths, and that they're all important parts of the opportunity. And the first is, and we do this. Our website structured the same way: learn, go green, speak out. So, what does it mean to learn and talk about the climate crisis? So, in addition to being all of the occasions that were named at the opening today, it is also Climate in the Pulpits weekend for Interfaith Power and Light. So we are just one of many communities, about a dozen in DC and Maryland, that are raising up climate conversations this weekend and talking about what is happening to our climate. That might not seem like such a meaningful act by itself, but it really is. Talking about climate change is harder than it sounds, and we're not having enough conversations about it. Many people are concerned about climate change, but they don't bring it up. This is so common that it has a sociological name. They call it the spiral of climate silence. People are worried about climate change, but they don't think other people are worried about it in their lives, so they don't talk about it. And then the other people don't hear those conversations and they don't talk about it. And it also makes us uncomfortable to talk about. There's a brand new book, which I happen to have on my desk, by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, called Saving Us. And the whole principle of this is to have conversations about climate change as a pathway to being able to find solutions together. And it's based on a TED Talk, which is very popular and easy to find. I'll try to put it in the chat when I'm done talking, about opportunities to open conversations about climate change and to take that bold act of having a conversation with someone in your life about why you care about this issue. Rabbi Sunny covered well that there's an abundance of things we can do as personal consumers, right? We have choices every time we spend money, every time we order food, every time we think about where to get in, how to get somewhere, or what to do. We have choices every time. And if we think about those choices with the climate in mind, we can make better choices, and we can share information with each other about the new ways that we need to live to be resilient in this warming world. I'll share just a few resources in the chat about energy choices at home. Things about the questions I get a lot are about ways to improve our home's efficiency, ways to put solar panels on our roof so we're getting our energy from different sources, ways to subscribe to community solar through your energy bill, which is an option for Montgomery County and DC residents now. And then how to navigate the opportunities we have to choose wind energy credits through our energy bill. So these are just some of the things that are out there. And I gave a previous workshop a few months ago with Bradley Hills about these kinds of options. But I'll just share a bunch of links in the chat for both DC and Maryland residents. There are ways to think about banking in ways that are greener. And we're thinking a lot, and there are ways to think about eating in ways that are a lot greener. And there are ways to think about caring for your lawn in ways that are, so in any category, if you just know that there are probably greener choices, you can probably make those choices mindfully in the moment and find resources. And I'm happy to be a resource if you, and then there's, the other thing that's a good resource is called greenpages.org, which is from Green America, an organization where I used to work, that has lots of it'll give you good ideas for greener businesses to support anytime you're making a choice. And finally, and the one that I just want to make sure everyone feels is critically important is speaking out as part of a movement large enough to take action at the systemic level, to change laws. We are not gonna, I think these last few months have made it even clearer to everyone that the system that we are part of is a system in which just a few fossil fuel polluters, corporate polluters, are responsible for the vast majority of the damage that we're facing, and that none of our individual choices are the reason we have a climate crisis by themselves. It is truly because there are systems set up in this country that perpetuate the ability of fossil fuel companies to damage our Earth's only climate without consequence or accountability. So for some reason, so many of us get focused when we think about the climate crisis on, whether we're recycling as much as we could, or whether we personally, still need to use our car sometimes, and it's important to take those choices seriously, but please don't lose sight of the fact that we need to join together in a movement large enough to change laws. And that is the only way we are going to really tackle the climate crisis. And so any faithful response to the climate crisis has to include advocacy and joining with the movements that are speaking out effectively at every level, state, county, and federally. For most of the time I've been in this work, I did not really have federal legislation before Congress to talk to people about that was really meaningful and exciting. But as you heard from Bob, that we are in this incredible moment where there's real serious climate legislation, before Congress inside the Build Back Better Act, and even with some of the changes that Senator Manchin insisted on, the bill as it stands now is still really, really amazing for climate progress. And very strong grassroots voices throughout the process have insisted that the investment in climate stay the same, have insisted that climate stay in the deal at all. And so we have a critical role to play in the coming weeks, just to continue to say, and I would say the most important target for those of us who live in Maryland is probably Senator Cardin, who's our more moderate Democratic senator. He's been a champ, but just to keep saying really clearly, go strong on climate, keep climate in the Build Back Better Act, and pass the Build Back Better Act. Those messages just need to be coming into his office strongly, continuously, until this bill passes both chambers. And I want to just share a little bit about what we see coming up in Maryland, at the state and county, and in Montgomery County in the coming months that we're thinking about. So at Interfaith Power and Light, we've sort of set our theme for the year as turning away from burning. And what we mean by that is that we don't think that the future can involve burning fossil fuels for electricity, any fossil fuels. We don't think that we can continue to have a combustion-based society if we want to have a livable climate. And the last fuel to go for a lot of us is what is sometimes called natural gas, but which we are calling methane gas. And many of us are still actually not only just causing its burning indirectly through power plants. We are turning, like on our stoves, we are literally burning fossil fuels in our own homes, with some significant impacts on our indoor air quality. Not just like the combustion is taking place inside our houses. So we, together with partners at Chesapeake Climate Action Network and Sierra Club, are thinking a lot about what it would mean to really get everyone thinking about what it would take to get off combustion, and that at every level. And really with a focus on what it means to really start thinking about turning away from gas and the ways that gas is built into our infrastructure. And that will take several forms. First of all, it will involve some of that greening work where people will think about alternatives to gas in their own homes and their own, replacing ovens when they can, or using alternatives, or switching to heat, electric heat pumps in commercial buildings and things like that. But then we are looking towards a possibility of a Montgomery County-based campaign that would ban new gas hookups and new construction. So it would say if you're going to build a new building and you're planning for the future, that building can't have, needs to be all electric from the beginning. Similar municipal campaigns have been successful in California, in various places like Berkeley, but they have also poked the bear of the industry getting very upset, and we know that. And that's part of the idea, to have campaigns in municipalities around Maryland that will force a conversation about the continued reliance on gas in our buildings. And then meanwhile, it remains to be seen exactly what it looks like, but we expect a strong, clean, healthy buildings component in a kind of climate omnibus bill of some sort in the state legislature this coming session, 2022. That session will start in January. And so there will be opportunities to also set our vision of a world beyond burning in the Maryland legislature as well. So I'm going to put so for those congregations that participated in person, in Climate in the Pulpits this weekend, they got us a bulletin insert that gave them an opportunity to speak out for a fossil fuel free future, and that we will use those petitions for messages to both county level and state level legislators when the time comes as part of this Turning Away from Burning campaign. If anyone would like to have the online experience of signing one of those bulletin insert petitions, I'm going to put a link in the chat that will give you an opportunity to give take the online version of that action. But I will leave it there and just ask everyone to really embrace that we live in an awesome moment, and we didn't choose this fight, but it chose us. And we later in the story of Jacob, this is later in the in the biblical narrative, he gets sort of accosted by a stranger who ends up in a battle with him, like an angel or something, that wrestles with him all night long. And then when he wakes up, he says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And I've always thought about what that we also are in the fight of our lives with this enemy we didn't choose, and that we still can wrest a blessing from it, that we can insist that this work for a climate just world blesses us by the way we do it and the way we do it together.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Joelle. Thank you. We're going to open up the conversation to Q&A, and I'm going to start with Marty Gansglass, who had a question. Marty, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, why don't you go ahead and ask our speakers?
Okay, well, the question's a simple one. We're looking to the future of 2030, but yet we've seen these horrible wildfires, terrible wildfires, rising seawaters, floods, all kinds of natural disasters. And the question really is, what are we doing in the immediate future? What do we do before 2030 when we hope to improve the climate of the world? What do we do now? What should the government be doing to protect communities from rising waters, wildfires, storms, et cetera, et cetera? And that, to me, seems like the opportunity for the education of the American public on the reasons why we're doing this, why we're sandbagging and clearing brush, et cetera, because of the climate change effects of these natural disasters.
I mean, I'll take a quick crack at it because it's a great question. And that falls into the category of what's called adaptation, trying to adapt to the climate impacts that are already baked into the system because of the carbon pollution that we put into the atmosphere historically. And so it's a huge problem. We're not going to be able to turn around the kind of damages that we've been seeing, the kind of, this epic 400-year drought that we've been seeing out in the West, these record-breaking heat waves that actually are deadly. And so mitigation efforts are the kind of, there's relief work, which needs to be stepped up, but FEMA is overwhelmed and is not a long-term solution, but definitely we need more resources for relief work for people who need it when disaster does strike. Second, we need to harden our infrastructure, if you will. Third, we need to modernize our floodplain charts and recognize that we can't just continue to rebuild homes in flood zones. And so there are all kinds of adaptation pieces that need to be done. But what we really need to be about between now and 2030 is turning this ship around. And the exciting thing, and sometimes those of us to talk about climate change, kind of the reason for the climate silence sometimes is that we come across as being these sort of dreary folks and doom and gloom wringing our hands. Nobody wants to hear it, but there's huge opportunity here. Right now, in clean energy across this country employs 3 million Americans. That's 3 times as many people as are employed in the production and refining of fossil fuels. These jobs pay on average 25% more than the median wage. And so these are good jobs, and a lot of them are good union jobs. These are jobs for pipe fitters, electricians, carpenters, roofers, helping to improve efficiency in our homes and our factories, and helping to build the next generation of all electric cars, and helping us to get more clean power from the wind and sun. And this is exciting. Wind and solar power in this country has constituted 80% of all the new electric generating capacity installed in the country over the past year and a half. And this year, first 8 months, 86% of all the new generating capacity in this country has been wind and solar. Why? Because it's now cheaper in most parts of the country than to continue to fuel aging coal plants. And across most of the world now, in 2020, 2/3 of the world, it was cheaper to put in wind and solar than to put in coal plants. And so this is exciting. Clean energy is going to attract approximately $30 trillion in investment globally over just the next couple of decades. The White House says by 2030, it's going to create 30 million new jobs worldwide. This is the economic play of our lifetime. And what's coming out of Glasgow, what's coming out of Build Back Better, what's coming out of capitals all over the world is a consensus, a message to markets, to investors, and to our children that the future belongs to those people who are going to invest in clean energy. And so it's an exciting opportunity.
Thank you. Judy has the next question. She'd like to ask Rabbi Sunny talk about the concept of climate Sabbath. Thank you, Bob.
Yes, I think, if we're talking about integrating, consciousness into our everyday lives, it helps to start with one day that you can fully look at your actions. And I think Rabbi Sunny has a good idea to start with.
Well, let me say, first of all, I am a dreamer, like Jacob and Joseph. Chalomi. I am a dreamer. And oftentimes when I get up and speak in front of my congregation, I'm engaging in an in-the-moment thought exercise. That's a trust that's been built up over a great deal of time. So I will first say, as a disclaimer, the people on this call who are really doing the hard work are Joel and Bob, and I've been a great admirer of Joel's work for a long time because they're doing the tachlis, the practical stuff of what you need to do. But we are all focused, not and rightly so, on what we do as individuals. And the question kept popping up: what can we do as people of faith, and what can faith communities, which still have a tremendous amount of power, if indeed they are unified and motivated towards a cause? Even though we know we have all issues with shrinkage of communities of faith and a generation that doesn't seem to relate. Well, if communities of faith were to make climate change their raison d'etre, so to speak, you might be able to attract young people who also feel that that is the most important issue of the moment, setting that aside. So that's a way of introduction. So noticed, first of all, this is not a unique concept. Colleagues of mine, Rabbi David Seidenberg in particular, and many others, have talked about this idea of this year in the Jewish cycle of years is what we call a Shemitah year. And this is the biblically mandated agricultural timeout every 7 years. And of course, Jews have Shabbat once a week. And the Sabbath is supposed to be a day where we minimize the energy use connected to transportation, manufacturing, and commerce. And there have been some studies out now that say that we could reduce greenhouse emissions by about 1/7 if literally we would take a day off. So if we act, and by the way, this past and current COVID year of 18 to 20 months now has also given us a hint, because using computer models to generate a COVID-free 2020 for comparison, NASA found that between February and December of 2020, since the pandemic began, and pandemic restrictions, it seems, reduced global nitrogen dioxide concentrations by nearly 20%. Global COVID-19 lockdowns caused fossil fuel generated CO2 emissions to decline by an estimated 2.4 billion tons. So, in light of new research on carbon sequestration, following these principles of Shemitah, allowing soil to go fallow, poses an age-old, no-maintenance way to regenerate soil. And so, while the world's cultivated soils have lost between 50 and 70% of the carbon in those soils, which has entered the air as atmospheric CO2, giving us all a break makes a real difference. We could actually, in addition to reducing carbon outputs like burnt fossil fuels, we can draw carbon back into the ground by restoring organic soil matter as a natural sink. So there's a lot to be said for this. In fact, our rabbi said that exile will come upon the world because of failure to observe the Shemitah. So this timeout year. So my thought was that what if we actually did Shabbat right? And not just Jews on Saturday, but I don't care. It could be Christians on Sunday. It can be Muslims on Friday. It can be Buddhists. Pick your day. But if we each took a day once a week where we truly didn't burn fossil fuels for transportation, we truly did not cook over a hot fire, but rather ate cold food, prepared food, and really disciplined ourselves, as well as gave ourselves a true day off where stores didn't open. All right. Remember blue laws in Maryland? Let's bring back blue laws, not for religious reasons. Let's give the climate a break. Let's cut back on the amount of commerce. And also let's cut back on manufacturing. Let's close factories on Sunday. Give workers a true break instead of these 16-hour, 24-hour manufacturing cycles 7 days a week. So I think faith communities can use these principles to promote this idea. Now, like I said, I'm a dreamer, because how to get there is beyond my ken. But maybe as I retire, that might be, I'm not saying it will be, I'm saying it might be something to focus upon.
I was just going to add that I think the spiritual tech, and this speaks actually to both of the last two questions. The spiritual technology that congregations have to bring to this moment is really, really valuable, and that we have a lot in our own traditions and our own communities that can speak to what we need in this time. To the question of resilience, how are we going to get, no matter what we do now, we're going to live in a warming world, even though we have enormous decisions to make also about what that future will look like. And one of the things I learned that made a big impression on me is that when you see how communities fare through natural disasters, wealthy communities will be fine no matter what. But in the poor communities, the ones that are deeply socially networked, where everyone has community and knows each other, get through those disasters much, much better than those where those connections are not there. So who builds those kinds of resilient communities where people check in on each other and and know who needs what. And, that's the work of a congregation, right? So just to really, and then as Rabbi Sunny talked about, the rhythms of Sabbath and the rhythms of the Shemitah year, both of which are these customs that, in my mind, put an asterisk next to the idea of land ownership. I mean, right? Like they say, like, yeah, you kind of own this in some way and in some meaning. And it's the same way that a land acknowledgement puts an asterisk, right? It says, yeah, you preside over this land. You feel like you get to make all the decisions about what happens here. But in fact, those are happening in a larger context in which God is the real owner, and in which you have a lot of interdependence and like accountability and responsibility to each other, and to other species and to the future. And I'm grateful for all of those things that come out of our traditions that can, as we see the ways that some of the sort of logic of capitalism is really, really reaching its, is breaking down in the final analysis here. We have this strong teaching from our sacred traditions about what an alternative vision might look like.
Thank you, Joelle. I'd like to ask one other question, and it has to do with justice, eco-justice in particular. As we look at the climate emergency, and we've spoken about how there's unequal effects across the world. And I also wonder if, even in our local communities, if we try to make it so that people who are impoverished have more we spread the resources out more justly, that this actually lessens the pressure on the earth. So if there's practical ways that we could actually do this, I know that our churches and our congregations and communities are working on this, but any final thoughts?
Well, I'll say something real quick in response. One is that the fossil fuel industry has developed in such a way that it has created sacrifice zones around the country. If you go to the Gulf Coast, particularly Louisiana, but even parts of Mississippi, Alabama, and certainly Texas, you see that. And people are asked to live in places that suffer worse storm surge and hurricanes because wetlands and coastal communities have been cut up to facilitate pipelines and to get ships out to the Gulf of Mexico to drill for oil. And we've seen it in the Permian Basin in Texas now, where Waco, Texas is now experiencing earthquakes, which are consequential to the fracking that's going on out there in the shale fields. So this kind of sacrifice zone, but I would like to tie your question to an important point that Joelle just made about capitalism, which is that, the problem for us isn't capitalism per se. It is our unwillingness and inability to constrain the excesses of capitalism, if you will. And we're seeing a great example of that right this very moment, because the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is trying to defeat the Build Back Better Act in Congress. And their qualm is that the Build Back Better Act asks corporations to help pay for this by paying their fair share. And it's important to remember this. U.S. corporations are going to post profits this year, record profits of $3.1 trillion. Never in the history of the country have we seen anything like it. It's 33% more than the last record, which was set in 2014. They're going to pay $275 billion in federal taxes on $3.1 trillion in profits. We would all like to have that kind of a tax portfolio. That's 9% of earnings. That's the effective tax rate. And the chamber's out there saying, "Oh my goodness, you're gonna hurt the economy if you ask these corporations to pay their fair share." And just to kind of close the deal here, we remember these corporations got a tax cut. A 40% cut in their taxes. They went from 35% to 21%. And we were told, oh boy, this is going to be jobs, growth, new factories. Didn't happen. They used the money to buy back stocks, 90% of which are owned by the wealthiest 10% of the people in this country. So folks, nobody begrudges anybody profits as long as they're not made at somebody else's expense or the expense of the environment or public health and safety. But we got to pay our fair share in this country to support an educated workforce, healthy customers, roads, the kinds of things that every business depends on to thrive. That only makes sense. So when you hear this kind of argument about, boy, we shouldn't have to pay for this kind of thing, we all need to go that.
Whoa.
Can
Joelle?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Well, so the Pope Francis in his encyclical teaching on ecology says there aren't two crises, one social and one ecological. There's only a single crisis. And we need to really challenge ourselves with environmental justice to actually ask what is the error that's at the heart of both racism and social injustice and the climate crisis, because it's really emanating from the same error. And the book I mentioned before by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe says, I found this very memorable. She says, a failure to care about the climate crisis is a failure to love. And I thought, wow, that's really also what racism is, right? These are failures to love. And if we are in communities that are mandated to love, then we need to figure out how to succeed at love better. I think I want Great. One of the things we try to do in our work is to make sure that we are working. Is to make sure that we are doing our work that in a way that is following the lead of and accountable to the communities that are most impacted, worst and first impacted by the climate crisis. That we are following the lead of Indigenous communities and communities of color that are at the front lines of the climate crisis. And I have been so inspired in particular by the way that the fights against some of the pipelines in Minnesota and in the Midwest, most recently the fight against the Line 3 pipeline led by Indigenous folks, has really been this moment where the harm of colonialism and the harm of racism and the harm of the climate crisis and fossil fuel energy really exist in the same protest. And the Indigenous water protectors call themselves water protectors, not protesters, because what they are doing is fundamentally about protection and care. And I want to really follow their lead in the way we think about our role as protectors.
Diane, are you there? Hello?
So are the leaf blowers.
Diane is muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. Stahis, yes, enjoy.
Yes, my husband Stahis, who worked with World Bank and various other organizations like that. I'm sorry, we have leaf blowers outside. Hang on. He has a question. What can we do together to assist the poor countries? He's trying to get them to stop for a moment. To assist the poor countries that are impacted by damaging our earth. Should we, for instance, set up an interfaith team? I think they're on our ceiling.
Oh my goodness.
Blowing off leaves. should we set up an interfaith team to plan and help to implement our projects in complementary reinforcing? In other words, should a follow-up of today's meeting lead to the establishment of some mechanism of systematic cooperation among us?
Good question. I'm going to mute. Okay, go ahead, Joelle, and or Bob.
Yeah, Bob may have more to say about this in general.
We're about at the end of our time,
To the
too.
extent that the U.S. has made commitments through the UN process around helping countries adapt, we can advocate with the government to fully fund those commitments. I know last time around, at least under the Obama administration, it took some grassroots advocacy in Maryland, for example, while Senator Mikulski was the ranking member of the relevant committee, to make sure that she fully appropriated the funds that we had committed to those countries under the UN process. So I think there'll be probably continue to be opportunities to do that kind of advocacy. I'll also just say that those of us who are part of these larger faith denominations almost all have some kind of relief organizations doing work in other countries that are supporting folks on the front lines of the climate crisis already and are seeing quite directly what the impacts of climate crisis are in those places. And I've been, the Catholic Relief Services group is particularly doing particularly good education work around the climate crisis impact. So I think that some of our faith-based relief agencies could be a pathway forward, I think, for that are already very well trusted by and connected to our congregations all over the country.
Thank you, everyone, and we really appreciate you all taking time to speak with us and for sharing with us today. And we are looking forward to our interfaith service in about 25 minutes. So we're going to be concluding our discussion at this point, and we give our blessing to everyone. And next week, we will be having a regular adult ed session as well. Yoshi, did you want to just share what our topic is next week? Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and I will be letting everyone say, oh, Judy. Okay. No.
I'm just saying goodbye. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
I was going to tell her, studying ice in the Antarctica. She's presently driving a tractor to the Antarctica. Think of it.
Okay.
Ian, you're still there?
Yes.
I just wanted to tell you that I set up something at church here where there's how many of us in person? 6 or 7 of us in the lounge, and I've got it. We're on, the TV in the lounge here, so those of us in person are able to attend. So,
wow, that's great.
And I plan on doing this every Sunday. So if people are coming like to the early service and then want to join.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.